The courthouse basement smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. Thomas Mercer sat in the back row, shoulders hunched beneath a flannel shirt that had faded from blue to something closer to sky after rain. November light filtered through windows set high in the concrete walls, pale and clinical. Around him, the folding chairs creaked as men in cleaner boots shifted their weight, flipping through auction catalogs with the bored efficiency of people who knew exactly what they wanted and exactly what it cost. Thomas knew what things cost too. The knowledge sat in his jacket pocket in the form of 3 envelopes he hadn't opened in a week. Property foreclosure. Final notice. The words didn't change no matter how long you waited to read them. His cattle ranch, 200 acres his grandfather had cleared by hand, belonged to the bank now. The herd had been sold at a loss that still made his chest tight when he let himself think about it. His daughter Emily had deferred her acceptance to the state veterinary program without telling him until it was done, her voice small on the phone. "We'll figure it out next year, Dad." He'd driven 3 hours to this auction for no reason he could articulate. Maybe because a man who'd lost everything still needed to sit somewhere that felt like forward motion, even if he couldn't afford to buy a decent pair of gloves. The auctioneer's voice droned through lot after lot. Grazing land near Casper. Mineral rights in Carbon County. Each time the gavel fell, someone walked away owning a piece of Wyoming, and Thomas stayed exactly where he was, broke, 47 years old, and wondering when he'd stopped recognizing his own hands. They looked like his father's hands now, scarred and thickened, the kind of hands that knew work but had forgotten prosperity. By 4 in the afternoon, the room had emptied to less than a dozen men. The auctioneer loosened his tie, consulting a clipboard with visible reluctance. "Last item," he announced, sounding like he was apologizing. 640 acres Sweetwater Basin. Bottomland. Experienced significant flood damage in the spring of '82. Condemned by the Bureau of Land Management. No maintained road access. No utilities. No structures. Someone in the third row laughed, a short, bitter sound. "We'll start the bidding at $500. The auctioneer waited. Silence stretched like wire. "250? More silence. He sighed, glancing at the county clerk. $50 then. "Do I have $50 for 640 acres? Thomas didn't decide to raise his hand. His arms simply lifted, powered by something older than thought, the same stubbornness that had kept his ancestors pushing west into territories that didn't want them. The auctioneer's eyes found him in the back row, and for a moment the man looked genuinely surprised, as though he'd expected the land to go unclaimed entirely, to return to whatever bureaucratic limbo had birthed this auction in the first place. $50 to the gentleman in back. Going once. He paused, scanning the room with theatrical hope. Going twice. The gavel came down with a sound like a bone breaking. Sold. Thomas walked to the clerk's table on legs that felt disconnected from his intentions. He counted out 2 20s and a 10 from his wallet. Money he'd earned fixing fence for a neighbor, money that was supposed to buy groceries for the next 2 weeks. The clerk stamped the deed and slid it across the table without meeting his eyes, as though witnessing something vaguely embarrassing. Outside, the November wind cut through his shirt, and he stood in the courthouse parking lot holding the deed in both hands, studying it like scripture. The paper was water-stained along one edge. Even the documents bore scars here. 3 days later, he borrowed his neighbor's truck and drove out to see what $50 had purchased. The service road was barely visible, overgrown with sagebrush and punctuated by washouts where the spring floods had rewritten the terrain. Cottonwoods lay across the path like fallen soldiers, their root systems torn from earth that had finally betrayed them. Thomas drove until the road disappeared entirely, then continued on foot, boots sinking into mud that smelled of iron and ancient things. When the valley opened before him, he stopped breathing for a moment. Water stood everywhere, not a river or a lake but something between, pools reflecting the late afternoon sky so perfectly they seemed like wounds in the world, places where you could fall through into another version of November. Native grasses grew chest-high where the floods had receded, fed by silt that had traveled hundreds of miles to rest here. The land rolled away toward distant bluffs, empty and enormous, a place that looked like it had never known a fence or a name. Thomas walked to the edge of the largest pool and stood listening to the silence. It wasn't the absence of sound but the presence of something else. Wind through grass, the distant cry of a hawk, water moving invisibly beneath the earth. He thought about Emily studying biology textbooks at the kitchen table late at night when she thought he was asleep, her highlighter squeaking across pages about things he couldn't help her understand. He thought about his father teaching him to read the weather in the color of morning light, knowledge that felt obsolete now, belonging to a version of the world that was quietly disappearing. The sun touched the horizon, igniting the water pools into molten gold. In that light, Thomas heard something that made his pulse catch, rhythmic, distant, unmistakable. Hoofbeats. He turned sharply, scanning the grass and the tree line in the empty distance beyond, but there was nothing. Only wind. Only the valley breathing its own private breath. He stood there until the light failed completely, listening to phantom horses run through land that couldn't hold them, and wondered what else might be hiding in places the world had forgotten to look. Thomas returned to the valley 3 days later with a canvas tent, a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm during the drive, and binoculars his father had carried in Korea. He told himself he was surveying the property, making plans. The truth sat heavier. He had nowhere else to be. The neighbor's couch where he'd been sleeping smelled of other people's lives, and the silence there was the wrong kind, full of pity and carefully unasked questions. Dawn broke over the flooded basin like something being born. Mist rose from the standing water in columns that caught the light and turned it amber, then gold, then white as the sun climbed. Thomas sat on the hood of the borrowed truck, steam from his coffee mingling with his breath, and watched the land wake. Sandhill cranes called from the marshes, their voices ancient and melancholy. Red-winged blackbirds announced territories in the cattails. The wind moved through the grass in visible waves, and he understood for the first time that emptiness was not the same as lifelessness. He waited with the patience his father had tried to teach him, the kind that came from understanding you were the intruder here, not the center. 2 hours passed. The sun rose higher. His coffee went cold. And then, through the shimmer of heat beginning to rise from the wet earth, he saw movement near the tree line, 2 miles distant where willows clustered thick along what had once been the river's course. Through the binoculars, the world narrowed to a circle of clarity. Horses. Not 1 or 2 strays, but a herd moving through the tall grass with a fluid coordination that spoke of ancient knowledge. He counted carefully, his hands steadying against the truck's warm metal. 17 animals, maybe more obscured by the terrain. Bays and grays, a sorrel with a splash of white across its chest, and 1 pale mare the color of winter wheat, moving at the herd's edge like a sentinel. Thomas watched them for an hour, barely breathing. They grazed the rich grass the floodwaters had left behind, drank from the clearest pools, and moved with the kind of grace that comes only to things that have never known confinement. No halters had marked these necks. No shoes had ever touched these hooves. They were wild in a way that made the word feel inadequate, too small for what he was witnessing. That night, he slept in the tent and dreamed of his daughter as a child, running through a field he no longer owned. Over the next 4 days, Thomas documented the herd from shifting vantage points, learning their patterns the way he'd once learned the rhythms of his own cattle. They watered at dawn and dusk. They avoided the open center of the valley during the day's heat, preferring the dappled cover of the cottonwood groves. The pale mare, he'd begun thinking of her as the sentinel, always positioned herself between the herd and any potential threat, her head high, nostrils testing every shift in the wind. On the 5th morning he drove to town and found the county library, a brick building that smelled of dust and decades. The librarian, a woman with silver hair and suspicious eyes, directed him to the microfiche machine with the air of someone granting access to classified materials. Thomas scrolled through newspapers from the 1950s, his eyes burning in the dim light, until he found it. A headline from August 1952. Last wild horse herd removed from Sweetwater Basin. The article described a Bureau of Land Management roundup, claimed successful, final. The photographs showed corralled animals, wild-eyed and defeated, loaded into trucks bound for wherever the government sent things it had decided didn't belong. But the herd he'd seen was here. Now, 31 years later, impossible and undeniable. He asked questions at the feed store, the diner, the gas station. Old-timers shook their heads. Nobody had lost horses. Nobody remembered wild herds in the basin since the roundups. One rancher, ancient and skeptical, said only, floods change things. Make islands where there weren't any. Hide what needs hiding. On his 6th visit to the land, Thomas walked in on foot, moving slowly through the chest-high grass with his hands visible at his sides. The wind carried his scent ahead of him, soap and coffee and the particular smell of human worry. At 300 yards, the herd spotted him and froze, 17 statues carved from muscle and suspicion. The pale mare stepped forward, placing herself between Thomas and her family. Her coat caught the morning light, luminous against the darker bodies behind her. She was smaller than his memory had suggested, compact and powerful, with eyes that held an intelligence he recognized. It was the look of a creature that had survived by being smarter than the forces arrayed against it, by choosing flight or stillness at precisely the right moments, by protecting what mattered even when protection seemed impossible. Thomas saw his own life reflected in those eyes, the same wariness, the same refusal to surrender even when surrender would have been easier. She was guarding her herd. He was guarding the memory of who he'd been before the bank and the drought and the shame had stripped him down to this moment, standing in wet grass on land nobody wanted, watching horses that weren't supposed to exist. He sat down slowly, cross-legged in the grass, and stayed until the sun began its descent. The herd didn't approach, but they didn't flee either. They grazed, watching him watch them, and in that mutual observation something shifted. A recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of trust, or simply an acknowledgement that they now shared this broken, beautiful place. When Thomas finally stood to leave, his legs stiff and his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name, the pale mare was still watching. She didn't move as he walked backward toward the tree line, didn't lower her head to graze until he disappeared from sight. And in the truck, driving back toward the neighbor's couch in borrowed time, Thomas made a decision without speaking it aloud. Whatever happened next, he would not let anyone take this from them. Or from himself. Thomas became an archaeologist of his own property, excavating its history in courthouse basements and the dusty archives of the county clerk's office. He studied survey maps from 6 different decades, their paper gone brittle and yellow, tracking how the Sweetwater River had moved across the valley floor like a restless sleeper. The 1982 flood appeared in the records as a red line that had rewritten the entire basin, carving new channels and leaving behind islands of high ground where none had existed before. A place where 17 horses could vanish from the world without anyone thinking to look. At the library he found old brand registries and livestock reports. Nothing matched. No missing herd, no filed claims, no documentation of animals unaccounted for in 3 decades. It was as though the horses had materialized from the flood itself, condensed from water and want and the kind of stubbornness that made impossible things real. On a Thursday afternoon gray with impending snow, Thomas found himself in the cluttered office of Dr. Raymond Chin, a veterinarian who'd retired to a property north of town where he raised llamas and kept bees. The old man listened to Thomas's description of the herd with his eyes closed, fingers steepled beneath his chin, nodding occasionally as though confirming something he'd suspected for years. "If they've been isolated since the 50s, Chin said finally, opening eyes that were sharp despite their clouding, "you're looking at a genetic time capsule. These wouldn't be the crossbred Mustangs we see elsewhere. Spanish bloodlines mixed with ranch stock, quarter horses, whatever escaped over the decades. These would be pure descendants of the original wild herds. Phenotypes we thought were extinct." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. "That's valuable then. Scientifically." Chen's smile was sad. "Yes. Which means there are people who'd pay universities to study them." He paused, weighing his next words. "And people who'd pay considerably more to own them." The snow began that evening and didn't stop for 3 days. Thomas stayed in town, sleeping in the truck, watching the white accumulation through the windshield and thinking about horses standing in weather they'd survived for 31 winters without human intervention. When the roads cleared, he drove back to the valley expecting emptiness, but the herd was there, smaller shapes against the white expanse, their dark bodies stark and alive, proving once again that survival was a skill humans had forgotten how to teach. He made a mistake the following week. At the feed store, buying supplies he couldn't afford with credit the owner extended out of pity, Thomas mentioned the horses to a clerk who'd asked what he was doing with his condemned land. The young man's eyes brightened with the hunger people get when they've stumbled across something rare, something that might carry their name beyond the boundaries of their ordinary lives. The article appeared in the regional paper 4 days later. Ghost herd discovered on private land. Wild horses survived decades in hidden Wyoming valley. The reporter had embellished details Thomas hadn't shared, speculation dressed as fact, but the core truth was there. The horses, the mystery, the land that had kept its secret until now. The tourists came first. Cars appeared on the service road, people with expensive cameras and inadequate boots, trespassing with the casual entitlement of those who believe beauty should be freely accessible. Thomas posted signs, drove out twice a day to turn people away, but the property was too large and his resources too thin. He watched through binoculars as the herd moved deeper into the roughest terrain, spooked by voices and engine noise and the particular violence of being observed without consent. Then Marcus Webb arrived. He drove a truck so clean it looked digitally rendered, its paint job reflecting the winter sky in high definition. His handshake was firm and his smile was practiced and his boots had never seen mud. He represented Western Heritage Ranch Corporation, he explained, a conservation organization dedicated to preserving America's wild horse legacy through sustainable ecotourism and educational partnerships. "We'd like to acquire the property," Webb said, standing in Thomas's valley as though he already owned it. $50,000. 1,000 times what you paid. He let the number settle, watching Thomas's face for the reaction he expected. "We'd preserve the herd, naturally. Create viewing platforms, guided horseback experiences. Educational programs for schools. You'd be helping conservation, Mr. Mercer. Helping people connect with their heritage." Thomas took the contract Webb offered, a sheaf of paper thick as a Bible. That night, under lamplight in a motel room that cost $38 he didn't have, he read every page. The language was dense and deliberately obtuse, but on page 14 he found it. "Company retains right to breed, sell, or relocate animals as deemed necessary for optimal herd management and organizational objectives." He drove to the valley at dawn and found the pale mare standing at the edge of a frozen pool, her reflection trapped in ice beneath her hooves. She watched him with those intelligent, wary eyes, and Thomas understood that Webb's contract was a prettier version of the 1952 roundup. The same ending dressed in conservation language, the same elimination of wildness disguised as salvation. "No," he told Webb 3 days later, returning the unsigned contract. Webb's smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, a recalculation, cold and immediate. "Think carefully," he said, his voice still pleasant. "Your property taxes are about to reflect the land's new value. Current market rate for acreage with this kind of unique asset." He paused. "Can you afford to keep it, Mr. Mercer?" The new tax assessment arrived 6 weeks later. $8,000 annually, due in 90 days. Thomas sat in the borrowed truck with the notice in his hands, watching his breath fog the windshield, and understood that ownership was just another word for the thing they'd take from you last. Thomas found Margaret Thornhill through a librarian who remembered things nobody thought to write down. She lived in a house at the edge of town where hollyhocks grew wild along a fence that hadn't been painted since her husband died. 81 years old, spine curved from decades of bending over county clerk ledgers, she invited him inside with the directness of someone who'd stopped wasting time on small talk around her 70th birthday. "I remember the roundup," she said, pouring coffee into cups decorated with faded roses. 1952. My father was a wrangler on that drive. Government contract, paid by the horse. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the pot. He came home different. Wouldn't talk about it for years. She disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a leather journal, its binding cracked and spine broken from handling. Thomas opened it carefully, afraid the pages might disintegrate under his touch. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, entries dated across 3 weeks in August. He read slowly, his pulse thickening in his throat. August 19th, 37 head captured. Rough country breaking men and horses both. August 23rd, lost 6 animals in the breaks. Supervisor says report 0. Contracts by the head. August 27th, final count 73 delivered. Maybe 20 still out there in canyon country too thick to follow. Told to sign off complete. Government wants it finished clean. The final entry was a single line. Some things won't be caught because they've learned the price of trusting. He died believing they survived, Margaret said quietly. Said that land keeps secrets better than people do. Thomas photographed every page with hands that shook from something larger than caffeine. The journal was proof, not just that the horses existed, but that they'd earned their freedom through terrain and cunning and the willingness to disappear rather than submit. They were survivors in a lineage of survival, and their presence here was not accident but inheritance. Margaret made phone calls that afternoon, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 50 years connecting the right people to the right information. By week's end, a coalition had formed. Wild horse advocates from Colorado, tribal elders whose reservation bordered the basin's eastern edge, environmental lawyers who worked for principle instead of payment, and a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Chin who'd been searching for a story about resistance that didn't end in defeat. The county scheduled a public hearing for the first Thursday in March. Thomas spent the intervening weeks in a state of sustained anxiety that felt like low-grade electrocution, checking the valley daily to ensure the herd remained, that Webb's people hadn't found some legal mechanism to remove them before the hearing could occur. The pale mare watched him from increasing distances, and he wondered if horses could sense the particular smell of human desperation, that acrid compound of hope and terror. The courthouse filled an hour before the scheduled start. Ranchers who resented government oversight, activists who'd driven from 3 states away, journalists with cameras and recorders, and Marcus Webb sitting in the front row with 2 lawyers whose suits cost more than Thomas's truck. The air was thick with competing intentions and the residual smell of the morning's coffee burning on a hot plate someone had forgotten to turn off. Webb presented first, his PowerPoint glowing on a screen that descended from the ceiling with bureaucratic efficiency. Economic projections showed jobs created, tourism revenue, educational partnerships with universities. Photographs displayed his other properties: horses in pristine paddocks, families on guided trail rides, children petting animals whose wildness had been negotiated into something safe and marketable. His voice was reasonable, calibrated to sound like compromise rather than conquest. Responsible stewardship, he concluded, the words landing in the room like stones in still water. Preservation through access. Heritage through education. Thomas spoke last, standing at a podium worn smooth by decades of nervous hands. He had no slides, no projections, no lawyers flanking him like expensive certainties. He placed Margaret's journal on the podium, its leather cover dark with age and handling, and described watching the pale mare teach her foal to navigate the flood pools, how the herd moved through the valley like water remembering the shape of ancient channels. "These horses aren't a resource to be managed," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "They're proof that some things survive when we think we've destroyed them. They've been hiding for 31 years in a place we decided was worthless, and they've done it without our help, without our permission, without needing anything from us except to be left alone." He paused, meeting Webb's gaze across the room. "We owe them that. We owe the future proof that wildness can still exist if we're brave enough to protect it instead of profit from it." A tribal elder named Robert Drummond stood next, his hair white as winter and his hands scarred from a lifetime of working with horses. "My grandmother told stories of herds that knew the secret springs, the hidden grass," he said. "This land was sacred for grazing long before any deed was filed or fence was built. These horses came home. That's what my grandmother would say. They found their way back to where they belonged." The commissioners deliberated for 40 minutes that felt like geologic time. When they returned, the chairman's face was carefully neutral. 4-1, he announced. "The land will be designated a protected wild horse sanctuary under private stewardship. No development, no commercial use, no animal removal without documented cause." The room exhaled collectively. Webb left without speaking, his lawyers gathering papers with the bitter efficiency of people accustomed to winning. Thomas sat motionless, unable to process that the weight he'd carried for months had suddenly lifted, that the pale mare and her herd would remain wild in the only home they'd ever chosen. Outside, March light broke through clouds that had threatened snow all morning, and the world looked scrubbed clean, newborn, full of possibilities he'd forgotten how to imagine.